The CEO laughed at the single dad's backyard scrap car until he won the $5 million race. The morning Giselle looked into Wyatt's backyard, she laughed. Not politely, not briefly. It was the laugh of someone who had never been wrong and was certain she wasn't starting now. Mismatched tires, bare weld lines. A man in an oil-stained shirt crouched under a frame that barely resembled a car, his 5-year-old daughter beside him clutching a stuffed rabbit. Giselle ran Vantech Motorsport. She had built million-dollar race vehicles and won titles across 3 consecutive seasons. She had hired the best engineers money could find. And she had absolutely no idea that the thing rusting in that backyard was about to beat every car she had ever made across a $5 million finish line. Keep listening, because what Wyatt built in that backyard took 3 years and 1 race to prove everyone wrong. Wyatt had a routine that did not change. Every morning at 5:45, before Aria stirred, before the neighborhood made a sound, he came downstairs in the dark and put water on for 2 cups of coffee. He had done it since the week Grace died, and he had not been able to explain why he kept doing it for 2 full years after she was gone. He would pour the first cup for himself, set the second one on the corner of the workbench beside her photograph, and stand at the kitchen window looking out at the covered shape in the yard. The tarp was old and sun-bleached, the bungee cords holding it in place fraying at the hooks, but underneath it the frame of the car was always exactly where he had left it, exactly as far along as the night before. The neighborhood was the kind that Phoenix builds on its outer edges: wide lots, low fences, houses where people work with their hands and keep their garages open on weekends. Nobody asked much about the project in the yard. Isaac, who ran the repair shop 2 streets over and had 30 years of grease under his fingernails, had seen the frame going up piece by piece over months and understood what it was without needing to be told. Wyatt had been an engineer at Vantech Motorsport for 4 years before Cameron had him removed. That was the clean version of the story, the one that fit in a sentence. The longer version involved a design document Wyatt had spent 11 months developing a thermal management system built around natural convection rather than forced pump cooling, lighter, simpler, and more stable across extended high-temperature runs than anything Vantech had on the drawing board. He had submitted it through the proper channels, received a standard acknowledgement, and been told it would be reviewed in the next development cycle. 6 weeks later, Cameron presented a version of the same design to the board under his own name. 8 weeks after that, Wyatt was called into a meeting and informed that his contract would not be renewed due to performance concerns. The documentation of those concerns was thin and vague, the kind that exists to justify a decision already made. Wyatt cleared his desk, drove home, and sat in his car in the driveway for a long time before going inside. Grace had been alive then. She had met him at the door and held on to him for a while without saying anything, because she understood that some losses do not need to be explained before they are mourned. He did not take any of Vantech's documents with him. He did not need to. Every line of the original design lived in his head, complete and exact, the way certain things settle into a person when they have thought about them long enough and hard enough that the thinking becomes something closer to understanding. In the 2 years since Grace passed, the yard project had become the place where that understanding took shape in metal and wire and reclaimed components. Aria had grown up watching it happen. She was 5 now, old enough to have opinions about which tools made the most interesting sounds and which parts of the frame looked like they belonged and which did not. She had named her stuffed rabbit Gravel. When Wyatt asked her why, she thought about it for a moment with the focused seriousness that 5-year-olds bring to important questions, and said that gravel was always under the wheels but nobody paid attention to it, and then the wheels rolled over it and it flew far away. Wyatt had stared at her for a second longer than he meant to before going back to what he was working on. The Phoenix Desert Classic registration email arrived on a Thursday evening. The race was an annual open-class endurance event, 200 kilometers of mixed terrain outside the city. No commercial division restrictions, a flat prize purse of $5 million awarded to the first car across the line. Wyatt read the rules 3 times. He called Isaac. He told no one else. The automotive exhibition at the downtown convention center happened every spring, and Isaac had talked Wyatt into bringing the frame. Not a finished car. There were still months of work ahead, but enough of the assembly to show the engineering to people who might understand it and offer parts or materials in exchange for a credit in the entry. Registration. Wyatt rented the smallest available floor space along the far wall, backed the trailer in, and set up a simple placard with the car's specifications printed in plain text on a single sheet. He did not bring banners. He did not have a team in matching shirts. What he had was the car itself, and the ability to explain what it was to anyone who stood still long enough to listen. A few did. A retired fabrication engineer from a regional team spent 40 minutes asking technical questions about the convection channels, and when he left, he said he would send over 2 pieces of aluminum tubing that had been sitting unused in his storage unit. A parts supplier for off-road vehicles took a photograph of the suspension geometry. None of this made the morning notable. What made the morning notable was Giselle. She arrived with a group of 5 people, Cameron at her right shoulder, moving through the exhibition floor the way people move when they are used to having space made for them. Vantec Motorsports display occupied an entire corner of the hall, their newest competition vehicle elevated on a carbon fiber platform, polished to the kind of finish that takes a day and a half to achieve, and costs more than the car itself to maintain. Giselle wore a fitted dark jacket and moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who does this twice a year and has long since stopped being impressed by anything she sees. She was scanning the floor, not lingering, the way a person scans a room for 1 or 2 things worth remembering. Cameron said something close to her ear and tilted his head toward the far wall. She followed his line of sight. What she saw was Wyatt's car on its trailer, partially assembled, the frame visible, the weld lines unsmoothed, and 4 wheels that were plainly not a matched set. She saw Arya on the folding chair beside the trailer, the rabbit in her lap, watching the crowd with wide, patient eyes. Giselle turned toward the display and said nothing at first, and then she said, in a voice that was not quiet, that she wondered who had allowed this to be here. The people nearby heard it. Several turned. Wyatt straightened up from the component he had been adjusting and looked at her without expression. He explained, in the measured, unhurried way he explained most things, that the frame incorporated an asymmetric thermal diffusion principle in the engine housing, that the natural convection cooling eliminated the need for a forced pump system entirely, and that the projected friction reduction over a sustained high heat run was approximately 17% compared to conventional designs. Giselle let him finish. Then she said that the car looked like it had been assembled from a salvage yard. She turned and walked back toward the Vantec display, her group moving with her. Cameron lingered for a half-second at the edge of the crowd. He looked at the car with an expression that was not quite mockery, something tighter and less comfortable than mockery, before he turned and followed. The people nearby drifted back to whatever they had been doing. A few laughed softly, not cruelly, just the reflexive sound of people who feel a mild awkwardness pass. Arya had heard all of it. She looked up at her father and said nothing, watching his face to see what it would do. Wyatt crouched down so he was at her eye level and asked if Gravel felt small. She said no. He said that was good. Isaac stood at the back of the space with his phone in his hand, and he did not put it away for a long time. That night, in the quiet of the workshop, Wyatt opened his design binder to the pressure valve cluster schematic and circled a modification he had been considering for 3 weeks. He wrote a number in the margin, additional hours required, and a date. He did not think about what had been said that morning at the exhibition, or, if he thought about it, he processed it the way he processed most obstacles, which was to identify exactly where it intersected with the work in front of him, extract whatever was useful, and set the rest aside. The rest, in this case, was nothing useful. He added 15 hours to his project schedule and kept working. The problem with finishing the car was money, and Wyatt met it the same way he met every other problem, by calculating exactly how large it was and then working out, step by step, how to make it smaller. The remaining shortfall was roughly $8,000, covering the cooling shroud fabrication and the aerodynamic bodywork. He took on additional shifts at the repair shop, added 2 weekend consulting days, with a local amateur racing team that needed help diagnosing an intermittent misfire, and reduced his own household expenses to the kind of precision that left nothing unaccounted for. Isaac contributed materials from his own inventory, not money, which Wyatt would have refused, but components he had accumulated over decades, the kind of that useful things tend to be useful again. Arya asked once if they were poor. Wyatt told her they were careful. She seemed to accept this as a reasonable distinction. The engineering of the car was grounded in two principles that Wyatt had developed over years and refined in that backyard through iteration and failure, and iteration again. The first was that in a desert endurance race, the car that finishes is always more valuable than the car that leads the early kilometers. Overheating was the primary cause of retirement in the Phoenix Classic field. The combination of sustained high-speed output and ambient temperatures that routinely exceeded 40 degrees Celsius on the race surface created conditions that stressed forced cooling systems and punished any small failure in their operation. The natural convection system Wyatt had designed required no pump, no electronic control, and no redundant failsafe because it had no single point of failure to protect against. Thermal load was distributed passively through a network of channels machined into the engine housing walls, carrying heat away from the combustion core and dispersing it through the body structure of the car itself. Simpler, lighter, and under the conditions, the Phoenix Classic reliably delivered considerably more durable. The second principle involved the passive wind deflector mounted across the rear of the car's roofline. It was a mechanical system, not an electronic one, operated entirely by air pressure differential, angling itself without any driver input to reduce drag in crosswinds that a fixed-angle wing could not accommodate. Wyatt had learned the underlying mechanism from a man who had spent 40 years building race cars in the era before electronics made mechanical ingenuity feel obsolete. The mechanism was not complicated. It was just correct. At Vantech, meanwhile, Cameron was building. Giselle had approved a significant budget increase for the Phoenix Classic campaign, and the development cycle was running at full capacity. The car they were preparing, designation Vone, assigned to Cameron as lead driver, carried dual electric cooling pumps, a high-output engine tuned for maximum power delivery in the first 100 kilometers, and a bodywork package that had been developed in a wind tunnel at considerable expense. Cameron knew the entry list. He had seen Wyatt's name on it. He had checked the public record for any technical specifications on the car, registered as G00, and found nothing. This did not reassure him. Cameron understood engineering well enough to know that absence of public information about a design was not evidence of a design that wasn't worth knowing about. He had learned that lesson, among other ways, by reading someone else's work and recognizing its value before that someone else had the standing to protect it. 3 weeks before the registration deadline, Wyatt and Isaac drove the car out to a stretch of empty road on the edge of the city at 2 in the morning. No cameras, no observers, no record of any kind. The car ran. It was not flawless. The steering system had a vibration at high speed that Wyatt identified as a tolerance issue in the tie rod assembly and logged as a correction to be made before race week, but the engine ran for 40 minutes of continuous operation without a single overheat. Warning. When they pulled over and let the car idle, Isaac walked around it slowly with a flashlight and then came back and tapped the hood twice with 2 knuckles. Wyatt knew what that meant. It meant the car was real. There was an evening, 2 weeks later, when Arya came down with a fever that climbed through the night, and Wyatt moved his sleeping bag to the floor of her room and stayed there until it broke. He did not go to the workshop for 2 days. He did not consider whether this cost him anything in schedule terms. When Arya woke on the 3rd morning with clear eyes and a request for orange juice, the first thing she asked after was whether the car was still in the yard. Wyatt told her it was still there, and that he was too, and she seemed satisfied with both answers. Giselle brought her personal vehicle to the repair shop on a Tuesday afternoon for routine maintenance, oil change, brake check, tire rotation. She had not noticed the shop's name when her assistant booked the appointment. She noticed Wyatt when he came out to receive the car and stood there for a moment in the light from the service bay. She did not leave. She said nothing about the exhibition, and neither did he. He worked efficiently and returned the car to her in under an hour, and when she came to the front desk to pay, she glanced at the workbench and saw the photograph pinned beside the computer monitor, a woman in her early 30s, dark-haired, smiling in the particular way of someone caught mid-laugh. Giselle asked, without preamble, if that was his wife. Wyatt said she had passed. There was a brief silence, the kind that has a specific weight. Giselle left without any further comment. She left a tip that was double the service total and did not explain it, and Wyatt noticed it on the receipt and stood looking at it for a moment after she was gone. Cameron came to the repair shop. He did not call ahead. He drove himself, parked in the lot, and walked in with the particular confidence of someone who has decided in advance that the meeting will go the way they have planned it. He told Wyatt directly that he was prepared to offer $25,000 for the technical documentation of the cooling system and formal withdrawal from the Phoenix Classic registration. He said it as a practical proposal, reasonable on its face, the kind of offer that ends complications before they become expensive. Wyatt looked at him for a moment long enough that Cameron had to resist the impulse to fill the silence. Then Wyatt said that Cameron was standing in his repair shop offering $25,000 to tell him he couldn't win a race, and that one of them was wrong about something, and it was worth thinking about which one. Cameron left without the documentation and without the withdrawal. He sat in his car in the lot for a few minutes before driving away. Hannah had been covering the Phoenix Classic for 3 years, and she had developed a method of finding the stories that the race itself would not generate on its own. The official narrative always involved the well-funded teams, the corporate sponsorships, the familiar names. The real stories were almost always somewhere near the edge of the entry list, in the spaces where people with less money and more specific intent had placed themselves. She found Wyatt's entry, no sponsor listed, no public profile, a car designation written in handwriting on the registration form, and tracked down the shop address. She introduced herself honestly, told him what she was writing, and asked questions that were considerably better than the ones most journalists asked, which was to say she asked about what he was trying to do rather than what he was hoping to feel. Wyatt was careful with what he shared. He did not talk about Vantech. He did not talk about Cameron. When Hannah asked why he had left his previous engineering position, he said only that he had not left. She wrote that down and did not push further, and he respected her for it. Isaac had been building a file for 2 years. Not for any immediate purpose, he was a practical man. And practical men who have spent enough time around injustice tend to document things without being asked, the way carpenters square their work before the joint is glued, because that is simply what is done. The file contained photographs of Wyatt's original design document taken at his kitchen table in the month before the Vantech submission, time-stamped by the camera's metadata. It also contained a printed comparison he had assembled himself annotated side by side of that document, and the patent filing Cameron had registered under the Vantech name 6 months after Wyatt's dismissal. Isaac gave the file to Hannah without Wyatt's knowledge. On a Saturday morning, when Wyatt was at Aria's kindergarten event and could not be consulted, Hannah received it, read it, and did not publish it immediately. She held it. She knew the difference between a document that was ready and a moment that was ready, and the moment was not yet ready. Late in the week before the race, Giselle was reviewing the competitor list in her hotel suite, a standard pre-race habit, the same thing she had done before every Phoenix Classic since she took over Vantech. Her assistant had compiled the usual summary table. She was moving through it quickly until she reached the entry near the bottom of the field. No corporate affiliation, no sponsor line, car name listed as Gravel. She stopped. She remembered that word. She remembered the child with the stuffed rabbit and the binder on the workbench desk beside a photograph. She called Cameron into the room and asked him who Wyatt was. Cameron took a half-second too long before he answered. It was not a long pause in absolute terms. In the context of a direct question from an employer, it was a very long pause indeed. Giselle noted it and said nothing further about it that evening. She opened her laptop after Cameron left and stayed at the desk for a long time, working through documents that had nothing to do with race strategy. The night before the race, Wyatt ran through the final inspection by flashlight in the driveway. Fluid levels, tire pressure, fastener checks on the suspension points, a slow walk around the bodywork, looking for anything that had shifted during transport. Aria sat on the front step in her pajamas, Gravel in her arms, watching him work. She asked if he was scared. He said yes. She asked why he was doing it anyway. He said that her mother used to say that the only thing worse than losing was not starting, and that he had found that to be true. Arya was a moment, processing this with the particular thoroughness she brought to things that mattered, and then she said she would hold gravel extra tight during the race part. He told her that would help. Race day came in at 41 degrees, before 9 in the morning. The Phoenix Desert Classic staging area held 27 cars in 5 rows, and the contrast between the field's entries captured something true about the range of human ambition and human resources that no official program could quite communicate. Vantex Vone sat on the pole position gleaming, professionally branded, attended by a crew of 7 people in matching technical gear. Isaac had driven the trailer with Wyatt's car out at 5 in the morning, and they had staged in the far outside lane without incident. The car wore no sponsors, no decals beyond the handwritten race number on a whiteboard zip-tied to the door. The number was G00. Giselle stood in the elevated VIP observation area with a direct line of sight to the entire grid. She found Wyatt's car in the far lane without needing to search for it, and she watched it for a while, without speaking to anyone around her. Isaac walked Arya up to the general spectator section, found seats on the inside rail with a good view of the start and finish, and settled in with coffee and a quiet competence that had defined his presence in Wyatt's life for the better part of 3 years. Arya set gravel on the armrest beside her, facing the track, and said she wanted the rabbit to see. The start was clean. Vone pulled out of the grid with the authority of a car built for the first 40 kilometers, a high-output engine optimized for straightaway speed, aerodynamics tuned for flat desert terrain, $200,000 of engineering pointed at the first checkpoint. Cameron drove the way he always drove in the opening stage, which was with total commitment and the specific confidence of a man who had never yet had reason to doubt the machine under him. Wyatt ran 9th at the end of the first sector. He had expected to run 9th, or lower, on the open stretch. The natural convection system delivered no performance advantage on a flat, cool surface at speed. It was not designed to. Its advantage existed in conditions the race had not yet created: sustained heat, rough terrain, the cumulative punishment that 200 kilometers of desert apply to every component in a car that is not designed to absorb it gracefully. He ran 9th and tracked the temperature gauge on the custom dash cluster, and the number sat exactly where the math said it should sit. By the 40th kilometer, 3 cars had retired. 2 overheated cooling systems. 1 suspension failure on the rock section that opened the second stage. The ambient temperature had climbed to 43 degrees, and the road surface was throwing heat back at the undercarriages of every car that ran across it. Cameron's dash computer issued its first thermal advisory at kilometer 47, not a critical warning. An early alert, the kind designed to give a driver time to manage the situation before it became one. He reduced his pace by roughly 15% and maintained the lead. Wyatt passed 2 cars that had slowed with mechanical issues and moved into 7th. Hannah was positioned at the kilometer 60 checkpoint with a long lens and a notepad. She photographed Wyatt's car. As it came through, she would write later that the car's exhaust temperature looked wrong for its position in the race, meaning it looked too cool, meaning the engine was running at a lower thermal load than any car at that stage had any right to be running at. The terrain in the second half of the 50-kilometer stage shifted to broken rock, narrow passages, off-camber surfaces, the kind of ground that compresses a field because it eliminates speed as the primary variable and replaces it with precision. Wyatt had studied the course topography from satellite images and a personal scouting drive he had made 3 months earlier in his truck, pulling over at the difficult passages and walking them on foot. He knew where the road narrowed. He knew which lines looked fast but weren't, and which looked slow but could be carried at pace without braking. He moved from 7th to 5th in this stage without passing anyone directly. 2 more cars fell out of the running with failures, and he simply drove past the places where they had stopped. The car's temperature gauge did not move. By kilometer 90, Cameron was managing Vone's cooling system in real time through radio contact with his technical crew, adjusting pace to stay within thermal margins that were becoming tighter with every kilometer. He was still leading the race, but he was no longer leading it with freedom. Giselle left the VIP area and moved to the ground-level timing station after the kilometer 90 report came through. She did not explain this to the Vantech team members who had been standing with her. She stood at the timing board and watched the position updates cycle through. G00 was in 4th place at kilometer 90, 3rd at kilometer 103, after a car ahead of it developed a fuel pressure issue and slowed. 2nd at kilometer 120, after the field's second strongest entry, blew a tire on a rock crossing that Wyatt had cleared at full speed because he had seen the correct line during that scouting walk 3 months before and driven it without hesitation. The timing board updated. Giselle stood in front of it with her arms at her sides and did not say anything to anyone. Cameron heard the radio call informing him that G00 was in 2nd place at kilometer 122 with a closing rate that the timing computer was flagging. He asked for the gap, 4 seconds. He did not ask a second question. He understood what it meant for a car he had not believed in, had taken specific steps to ensure did not threaten him to be 4 seconds behind him at kilometer 122 in a 200-kilometer race. He pressed the pace. Vaughan's thermal system immediately registered the increase. The cooling pump cycled to maximum output. The gap held, then narrowed to 3 seconds, then to 2.5, and then the terrain closed in again as the course entered its narrowest passage, a section that the race notes described as a single vehicle corridor through a rock formation 200 meters long, approximately 10 feet wide at the narrowest point. Vaughan was too wide for the aggressive line through the passage. Cameron could run it, but only slowly, and he knew it, and he had accepted it as a time cost built into his race plan. He had not planned on Wyatt. Wyatt's car was narrower by 11 inches and lower by 4, and it had been built by a man who had walked that corridor on foot at 9 in the morning on a weekday in February with a tape measure in his pocket. Wyatt came through the passage at a speed that should not have been possible for that surface and emerged 20 meters ahead of Vaughan, which had been forced to brake for the entry. The radio channel from Cameron's car went quiet for several seconds. Then his engineer said his name once. Cameron said nothing back. The final 30 kilometers of the Phoenix Desert Classic run slightly downhill toward the city, the terrain opening from rock to packed gravel to a 2-lane hardtop section for the last 8 kilometers that feeds directly into the finish circuit. Wyatt led into the open section with a gap of approximately 3 seconds. Cameron closed it on the hardtop. Vaughan had more raw speed on flat surface, and the cooling system had stabilized after the pace reduction through the rock section. With 4 kilometers remaining, Cameron was 1 second behind. He made a move at the second-to-last turn that used the width of the road in a way that pushed Wyatt toward the outer edge, not a foul by the letter of the race rules, but a deliberate tactic, the kind born from a driver who has run out of cleaner options and has decided that the options available are acceptable. Isaac, watching from the spectator rail, raised his phone and filmed it without comment. Arya asked what was happening. Isaac told her to keep watching. Wyatt felt the pressure and did not fight it directly. He let Cameron have the inside line, absorbed the loss of momentum, and then took the last corner on the outside in a longer arc that cost him a fraction of a second and preserved the mechanical stability of a car that had been running at maximum load for over 170 kilometers. He came out of the corner ahead by 0.6 of a second. He crossed the finish line 17 seconds before Cameron. The margin was clean, unambiguous, and recorded simultaneously by 4 independent timing systems. Wyatt brought the car to a stop in the designated finishing area and sat in the driver's seat for a long moment without moving. He removed his helmet and held it in both hands against the steering wheel. He did not look at anyone. He looked up through the windshield at the sky, which was the flat white blue of a Phoenix afternoon in late spring. Then he opened the door and got out. Arya had been released through the spectator gate by a race official who had been stopped by Isaac long enough for the child's father to cross the finish line. She ran across the staging area with gravel under one arm and ran into Wyatt at speed, and he caught her and lifted her up and held her against his shoulder. She said that he had won. He said that gravel had won. She pulled back and looked at the car, and then at him, and considered this seriously. Then she decided that both things could be true at once. The prize ceremony was compact and efficient in the way race ceremonies are when the organizing committee has been running the same event for 11 years. Wyatt received the trophy and the check, in front of a small grandstand of remaining spectators, gave a brief and technically precise answer to the announcement host's questions about the car, and thanked Isaac by name. He did not mention Vantech. He did not mention Cameron. He did not mention the exhibition hall, or the woman who had laughed. Hannah was in the press area during the ceremony. She had already filed her race report. After the ceremony, she opened the second document, the one that asked a question she had been holding for several weeks about the origin of a particular engineering design, and she published it through her editorial outlet with the Isaac provided materials attached as a supplementary appendix. She did not accuse anyone of anything in the text of the article. She described two documents, their dates, their content, and their shared technical architecture. And she asked a single question in the final paragraph, which was whether the Phoenix Classic winner had raced on ideas that had always been his own. She left the answer, as good journalists do, to the reader. Cameron drove his car across the line in second place, 16 seconds behind Wyatt, and went directly to the Vantech hospitality area without speaking to the press. Giselle was not in the hospitality area. She was standing at the edge of the staging zone when Cameron returned, and she waited until the crew had moved away before she spoke to him. The conversation was private. Nobody recorded it. When it ended, Cameron left the venue in his personal vehicle and did not return. Giselle walked through the staging area toward the far end, where Wyatt was still standing near the car, while Isaac supervised its loading onto the trailer. She approached without the group she usually moved with, without an assistant, without anyone ahead of her to make the introduction or establish the context. Wyatt saw her coming and waited. She did not speak immediately. She looked at the car, at the handwritten number on the door card, at the matte green paint applied by Roller in a single coat over bare metal, and then she looked at Wyatt. She said she had not known about the patent filing until 2 nights before. Wyatt looked at her for a moment and then said that he believed her. She said that Cameron had been with her company for 6 years and she had trusted his technical assessments without independently verifying their origins, and that this was a failure of her own oversight and not a defense of the outcome. She stopped there. She did not attempt to reduce what had happened to a misunderstanding or a procedural error or a matter of competing interpretations. Wyatt said that he knew Cameron had operated without her direction, and that this was not nothing, and that he also knew it did not change what had been taken from him or the years it had taken him to rebuild what was his in the only way that had been available to him. Giselle absorbed this without deflection. She nodded once, slowly, and said nothing to fill the space. It was the first time in 3 years that anyone connected to the original event had stood in front of Wyatt without an agenda, without a counter-argument, without a version of the story that required him to accept less than the plain truth. He did not forgive her. He also did not blame her for what Cameron had done alone. He simply extended to her the same accuracy he applied to everything else, and found that she held up under it. Isaac came around the trailer and looked at the two of them and went back to supervising the loading. He was not a subtle man in most respects, but he understood when his presence was the wrong kind of useful. The check was real, and the amount on it was $5 million, and Wyatt did not spend an evening staring at it or feel the particular vertigo that dramatic financial change is supposed to produce. He called the attorney he had used for the lease agreement on the repair shop and scheduled a meeting. He called the school to confirm Aria's enrollment for the following year. He sat with Isaac at the kitchen table that same evening, and they talked through several numbers and said very little that was not related to numbers. And when Isaac left, Wyatt stood in the kitchen and looked at the countertop for a while. Then he drove to the ice cream place that stayed open late, and he and Aria sat on the hood of his truck in the parking lot and ate their ice cream in the warm evening air. Aria had gravel in her lap. She was explaining something at length about whether rabbits would like ice cream if they could have it. Wyatt listened and contributed periodically to the question, which they did not resolve. 3 weeks after the race, the repair shop looked the same as it always had. The tools were in the same places. The schedule board above the front desk had the same handwritten abbreviations Isaac had taught Wyatt to use in the first year. The photograph of Grace was still on the workbench beside the computer. The car, the actual race car, gravel, the green one that had crossed the finish line first in the Phoenix Desert Classic, sat in the yard with its tarp removed. It sat in the open air, under the sky, in the same spot where it had been built. There was no reason to cover it anymore, and Wyatt had not replaced the bungee cords when one snapped off the last remaining hook. He had been thinking about what to do with a portion of the prize money for several weeks, and the idea that had persisted through all the other ideas was a workshop, not a racing operation, not a commercial engineering venture, not a company with a brand and a growth plan. A place. A space where people who had technical ideas and limited resources could come and use tools and equipment and the company of other people who were working seriously on something. He had not announced this or filed any paperwork. He had only thought about it, which for Wyatt was roughly equivalent to a decision. Giselle came on a Wednesday. She drove herself this time. She carried a single envelope, which she placed on the workbench beside the monitor and the photograph without preamble. She said it was a formal proposal for joint development of the thermal management technology. Not an acquisition, not a licensing arrangement, but a co-ownership structure with her name and his name, and the terms written in plain language by a contract attorney who had no relationship with Vantech. She said he did not have to answer that day. Wyatt looked at her, not the quick, evaluative glance of someone deciding whether to engage, but the longer, quieter look of someone taking an accurate measure of a person without the distortion of history. She met it without adjusting her posture or her expression, and he found, examining her in that clear light, that she was someone who could be stood in front of and looked at directly. He asked if she wanted coffee. She looked at the 2 cups on the bench. Both were present, as they were every morning, one in front of the monitor, one at the corner where the photograph sat. She looked at them for a moment longer than was required to register them, and when she looked up at him, her expression had changed in a way that was small and specific and had nothing to do with business. She said yes. Arya appeared from the back of the shop, where she had been arranging socket wrenches in a row of size, which was something she did when adults were talking, and she wanted to be near but not in the way. She came out holding gravel, studied Giselle with the frank, unmediated assessment that 5-year-olds apply to everyone equally, and asked if she was the woman who had laughed at her father's car. Wyatt started to speak. Giselle held up one hand and then crouched down to Arya's level, eye to eye, and said yes, that was her, and she was sorry. Arya considered this response carefully, turning it over in the way she turned important things over. Then she extended Gravel toward Giselle and said that her rabbit's name was Gravel, the same as the car, because gravel was small and not noticed, and then flew very far. Giselle took the rabbit in both hands and looked at it, and then looked at Arya, and said that it was an excellent name, and the person who thought of it must be very smart. Arya said she thought of it herself. Giselle said she had assumed so. Wyatt moved to the small side counter and poured from the pot he had brewed 20 minutes earlier. The afternoon light came through the high window at the far end of the shop and reached the middle of the floor in a wide, flat angle. He heard Giselle ask Arya a follow-up question about the gravel theory, not a perfunctory adult question, not a question designed to close the conversation, but a question that reached back into what the child had said and asked for more. He heard Arya answer it with the serious authority she brought to things she had thought about for a long time. He did not turn around to watch this. He stood at the counter and listened to it happen. Then he set 1 cup down where it always went, by the photograph, and the 2nd cup he carried to the workbench where Giselle was sitting, and he set it down in front of her, and he sat down on the stool across from her, and the 2 of them were quiet together for a moment in the way that people are quiet when the noise that was always between them has finally, with some effort and some time and some honesty, been cleared away. And